courtroom is silent. Not the kind of silence that comes before a storm, but the kind that follows an explosion.
Every head turns toward the witness stand.
A woman sits there, trembling, her hands gripping the wooden rail so tightly her knuckles have gone white. Judge Renee Porter leans forward, her reading glasses catching the fluorescent light. The prosecutor, Michael Torres, is frozen mid-step, his legal pad hanging loose in his hand. Defense attorney Priya Shah's mouth has fallen open slightly, professional composure shattered for just a moment.
And then the witness speaks again, 3 words that will undo everything. I lied before, on screen, Atlanta Criminal Court, 3 hours earlier. This is the story of a confession that nobody saw coming, a moment of truth that threatened to collapse an entire prosecution. A question that would haunt everyone in that courtroom when someone finally tells the truth after years of lying. Do we punish them for the past or thank them for the present? Welcome to a case that reminds us the justice system isn't always about what happened. Sometimes it's about what people say happened, and when those two things diverge on a witness stand, in front of a jury, under oath, the consequences ripple outward like cracks in glass. This is Under Oath, the confession that stunned the court. Let's begin with what everyone thought they knew. Jordan Hale sat at the defense table in an Atlanta courtroom on a Tuesday morning in October, facing charges that could put him away for 15 years. The charges were serious: fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction, the kind of white-collar crime that doesn't make sensational headlines but destroys lives quietly, methodically, like termites in a foundation. Jordan was 34. A former financial analyst at a mid-size investment firm, clean record before this. No prior arrests, no history of violence, no red flags that would make anyone look twice at him on the street. But according to the prosecution, Jordan had orchestrated a scheme to funnel client funds into ghost accounts, manipulating records to cover his tracks for nearly 2 years. The alleged amount, just over $3 million. The case had been building for 18 months. District Attorney Michael Torres had built his prosecution on a foundation of paper trails, forensic accounting, and witness testimony. Torres was known in Atlanta legal circles as meticulous. He didn't bring cases to trial unless he believed he could win them, and he'd won 73% of his trials over the past 5 years. This case, by all accounts, looked solid. The defense attorney Priya Shah had a different reputation. Shah was a former public defender who'd gone into private practice 7 years earlier, and she'd built a name representing defendants in complex financial cases. She didn't win by theatrics. She won by finding the holes in the prosecution's timeline, the gaps in the evidence, the moments where certainty became assumption. She'd already gotten 2 key pieces of evidence suppressed in pre-trial motions, arguing improper chain of custody. But everyone knew the case would come down to one witness, Claire Benton. On-screen graphic, Claire Benton, former colleague of defendant. Claire had worked alongside Jordan at the investment firm for 3 years. She'd been there when the alleged scheme began, and according to her initial statements to investigators, she'd seen Jordan accessing client accounts after hours, printing documents that he immediately shredded, taking phone calls in empty conference rooms with the door closed. Her testimony was the narrative thread that tied all the circumstantial evidence together. Without Claire, the prosecution had numbers and documents. With Claire, they had a story. Claire had given 2 formal statements to investigators. The first came 3 months after federal auditors discovered the discrepancies in the firm's accounts. She'd been cooperative, almost eager to help. She described a pattern of behavior that spanned months. Jordan staying late, Jordan nervous, short-tempered, Jordan asking her to cover for him when the compliance officer came asking questions. The second statement came 6 months later, after she'd been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. That statement was more detailed, more specific. She provided dates, times, conversations she claimed to have overheard. By the time the case went to trial, Claire Benton had become the prosecution's star witness. Judge Renee Porter presided over the trial. Porter was in her 16th year on the bench, known for running a tight courtroom. She didn't tolerate grandstanding from attorneys, didn't allow the kind of dramatic outbursts you see in television courtrooms. But she was also fair. She gave both sides room to make their case, and she took her role as a gatekeeper seriously. Evidence had to meet standards. Objections had to have merit. The jury had to understand what they were seeing and hearing. And the jury, 12 citizens of Fulton County, had been listening to testimony for 8 days. Now, before we go further, let's talk about what it means to be a witness in a criminal trial. When you take that stand and place your hand on a Bible or affirm to tell the truth, you're entering into a legal contract with the court. Perjury, the act of lying under oath, is itself a crime. It's not just morally wrong, it's a felony that can carry prison time. The reason is simple. Our entire justice system depends on witnesses telling the truth. Without that foundation, everything collapses. But here's the complication. People lie for all sorts of reasons: fear, pressure, self-preservation. Sometimes they lie because they've convinced themselves their version of events is true, even when it isn't. Memory is fallible. Perception is subjective. And when you add the pressure of a courtroom, cameras, attorneys cross-examining you, trying to poke holes in every sentence you speak, well, the truth can become a moving target. The prosecution had prepared Claire carefully. They'd gone over her testimony a dozen times. They'd anticipated the defense's cross-examination, rehearsed her responses, reminded her to stay calm, to stick to what she knew, to say, "I don't recall," if she wasn't certain. Michael Torres knew that Claire was vulnerable. She was a nervous witness, prone to rambling, easily flustered, but her story had remained consistent across multiple interviews, multiple statements. He believed her. Priya Shah, on the other hand, believed Claire was hiding something. The trial had opened with Torres, laying out the prosecution's theory in clear, methodical terms. Jordan Hale, he argued, had exploited his position as a financial analyst to systematically steal from clients over a period of 23 months. The scheme was sophisticated, but not complicated. Jordan had access to client accounts. He created shell accounts under fake business names. He transferred small amounts unlikely to trigger immediate red flags, into these accounts. Then he'd move the money again, layering transactions to obscure the source. By the time auditors caught the discrepancies, the money had passed through so many hands that tracing it back to Jordan required months of forensic work. On-screen graphic, prosecution's timeline, March 2021, January 2023. The prosecution's evidence was substantial. Bank records showing the transfers, digital logs showing Jordan's login credentials accessing the accounts in question. Email correspondence where Jordan asked IT to bypass certain security protocols, claiming he needed access for legitimate client work. And then, of course, Claire's testimony, tying it all together with eyewitness observations. The defense's counter-theory was more subtle. Priya Shah didn't claim Jordan was completely innocent. Instead, she argued that the prosecution hadn't proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt. She pointed to the fact that multiple employees had access to the same accounts. She highlighted gaps in the digital logs, periods where the timestamps didn't align with other evidence. She suggested that the real culprit might still be out there, and that the firm had pressured investigators to close the case quickly to avoid further reputational damage. But Shah's most aggressive line of attack was aimed at Claire Benton. During opening statements, Shah had told the jury to pay close attention to Claire's testimony. She'd hinted, without being explicit, that Claire's motives might not be pure. She'd reminded the jury that Claire had received immunity, meaning she couldn't be prosecuted for any role she might have played in the alleged scheme. And she'd promised that when the time came for cross-examination, the jury would see a very different picture of who Claire Benton really was. The first 7 days of trial had been dense with expert testimony, forensic accountants walking the jury through spreadsheets, IT specialists explaining metadata and login credentials. The firm's former compliance officer describing the internal investigation. It was dry, technical material, the kind of testimony that makes jurors' eyes glaze over, but everyone knew day 8 would be different. Day 8 was Claire. She'd taken the stand on a Wednesday morning. She wore a grey blazer over a white blouse, minimal jewelry, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked professional but approachable, exactly the image the prosecution wanted to project. Torres began with easy questions, establishing her background, her role at the firm, her relationship with Jordan. "We were colleagues," Claire had said, her voice steady. "We worked on some of the same accounts, collaborated on client reports. I'd say we were friendly but not close friends." Torres guided her through the timeline. When did she first notice unusual behavior from Jordan? What specifically did she observe? How often? Claire's answers matched her previous statements. Jordan working late. Jordan seeming stressed. Jordan asking her to tell the compliance officer that he'd been working on a specific client file when in fact she knew he hadn't been. "Did you think that was strange?" Torres had asked. "At the time, I thought maybe he was just behind on his work," Claire replied. "But looking back, yes, it was strange." The direct examination took most of the morning. Torres was careful, thorough, building brick by brick. By the time he'd finished, the jury had heard a coherent narrative. Jordan Hale had stolen millions, and Claire Benton had witnessed the evidence of that theft without understanding what she was seeing until it was too late. Then Priya Shah stood up for cross-examination. Shah didn't start aggressively. That's not her style. She began with pleasantries, establishing rapport, making Claire comfortable. She asked about Claire's educational background, her career trajectory, her performance reviews at the firm. Claire answered easily. The tension in the courtroom remained low. Then Shah shifted. "Ms. Benton, you testified this morning that you observed Mr. Hale working late on multiple occasions, correct?" "Yes. And you said these late nights occurred over a period of several months?" "That's right. Can you give us specific dates?" Claire hesitated. "I don't remember exact dates." "It was over a year ago." Shah nodded, as if this was perfectly reasonable. "That's understandable. Memory fades. But in your statement to investigators, you did provide some specific dates, didn't you?" On-screen graphic, Defense Exhibit 12, witness statement dated April 15th, 2023. "I believe so, yes." Shah approached the witness stand with a document. "I'm showing you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit 12, your statement to investigators from April of last year. Do you recognize this?" "Yes." "On page 3, you state that you observed Mr. Hale working late on March 7th, March 21st, and April 4th of 2022. Is that correct?" Claire scanned the document. "Yes. That's what I said. And you also stated that on these evenings you were in the office as well, working late yourself?" "Yes." Shah paused, letting the moment breathe. "Ms. Benton, I'd like to show you another document." She handed a second exhibit to Claire and copies to the judge and Torres. Torres stood immediately. "Your Honor, may we approach?" Judge Porter waved both attorneys to the bench. The sidebar lasted 3 minutes. The jury couldn't hear the whispered argument, but they could see Torres's body language growing more agitated. Shah remained calm, her voice low and steady. Finally, Judge Porter made a ruling. "I'll allow it. Proceed, Mrs. Shah." The on-screen graphic, Defense Exhibit 13, phone location data. Shah returned to the witness stand. "Ms. Benton, what I've just handed you is phone location data from your cellular provider for the dates in question. This data was obtained through a subpoena issued by the defense. It shows the physical location of your phone based on cell tower pings. Do you understand what this document represents?" Claire's face had gone pale. "I think so." On March 7th, 2022, the date you testified you were working late at the office, this data shows your phone was pinging off a cell tower near your apartment in Decatur. The office is in Midtown Atlanta. Those locations are approximately 12 miles apart. Can you explain that discrepancy? The courtroom had gone very quiet. Claire looked at the document, then at Torres, then back at Shah. I might have had my dates wrong. You might have had your dates wrong, Shah repeated. What about March 21st? Claire scanned the exhibit. I don't know. Maybe I wasn't there that night. According to this data, your phone was at a restaurant in Virginia Highland that evening. Does that help refresh your memory? I don't remember. Shah moved to the next date. April 4th. You specifically stated in your testimony this morning that this was one of the nights you observed Mr. Hale acting suspiciously. But the phone data shows you weren't in the office that night either. You were at a location in Buckhead. Can you explain that? Torres objected. Your Honor, counsel is testifying. The witness has stated she doesn't recall the specific evenings. Overruled. The witness may answer. Claire's hands were shaking. I must have been confused about which nights. It's been a long time. Shah didn't push harder. Not yet. She simply nodded and moved on, asking Claire about other details from her testimony, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the foundation crack. Now let's pause for a moment and talk about what just happened from a legal perspective. Phone location data has become an increasingly important tool in criminal defense. Your cell phone is constantly communicating with nearby cell towers. That communication creates a record, a digital breadcrumb trail showing where you were and when. This data isn't perfect. Cell tower pings can sometimes show you in a general area rather than a precise location, especially in urban environments where towers overlap. But when someone testifies they were in location A and their phone data shows they were in location B, that's a problem. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Claire being a credible witness. If the jury started doubting her credibility on one point, they might doubt her on others. And doubt in a criminal trial is a powerful thing. The standard is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. If the jury has reasonable doubt about even one element of the crime, they're supposed to acquit. Priya Shah understood this. She wasn't trying to prove Claire had lied about everything. She just needed to prove Claire had lied about something. Because once a witness is caught in one lie, the jury starts wondering what else might not be true. The cross-examination continued through the afternoon. Shah moved systematically through Claire's testimony, comparing her statements to documentary evidence. Phone records showing calls Claire claimed never happened. Security logs showing she'd left the office hours earlier than she'd testified. Email timestamps that contradicted her timeline. With each discrepancy, Claire's answers became less confident. I must have misremembered. I might have been confused. It's possible I was thinking of a different day. The phrases piled up, one after another, until the portrait of a reliable witness had been replaced by something much more fragile. But Shah still hadn't delivered her knockout punch. That came near the end of the day. Ms. Benton, let's talk about your relationship with Jordan Hale, Shah said, her tone shifting slightly. Not aggressive, but more pointed. More personal. Claire stiffened. We were colleagues. I already said that. Just colleagues? Yes. You never socialized outside of work. Not really. Maybe at company events. Shah approached with another exhibit. I'm showing you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit 18. These are text messages between you and Mr. Hale from February 2022, approximately 1 month before the alleged scheme began. Can you read the message dated February 14th aloud for the jury? Claire looked at the exhibit, and her face lost all remaining color. I don't think... Ms. Benton, please read the message. Torres stood. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? Shah turned to the judge. Your Honor, the prosecution has characterized the relationship between the defendant and this witness as purely professional. I believe these messages are directly relevant to establishing potential bias. Judge Porter considered. I'll allow it, but let's keep it focused, Ms. Shah. Claire's voice was barely above a whisper when she read. It says, "Last night was amazing. I haven't felt this way in years. Can't wait to see you again." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Porter gavelled for silence. Shah let the moment hang in the air. "Ms. Benton, you just testified under oath that you and Mr. Hale were merely colleagues. But this message suggests something quite different, doesn't it? We went on a few dates. It wasn't serious. A few dates. When did this relationship end?" "I don't remember exactly. Let me help you remember. According to these text messages, you and Mr. Hale were romantically involved from February through May of 2022. Is that accurate?" "Around that time, yes." "And how did the relationship end?" Claire hesitated. "It just ended. These things happen." "Who ended it?" "I don't remember." Shah produced another exhibit, this time email printouts. "These are emails from your personal account, Ms. Benton. In one dated May 22nd, 2022, you wrote to a friend, and I quote, 'Jordan broke things off, says he needs to focus on work. I feel like an idiot for trusting him.' Does that refresh your memory about who ended the relationship?" The tears were starting now, running silently down Claire's cheeks. "Yes, he ended it." "And were you angry?" "I was hurt." "Angry enough to want to hurt him back?" Torres objected strenuously. Judge Porter sustained it, instructing Shah to rephrase. "Let me ask it this way, Miss Benton. When federal investigators first contacted you about irregularities at the firm, when was that?" "June 2022. 1 month after Mr. Hale ended your relationship?" "I guess so." "And in your initial conversations with investigators, you immediately pointed them toward Mr. Hale as a potential suspect, didn't you?" "I told them what I knew." "What you knew, or what you wanted them to believe?" Objection. Sustained. Ms. Shah, final warning. But again, the damage was done. The jury had now learned that Claire Benton wasn't just a neutral observer who happened to notice suspicious behavior. She was a woman who'd had a romantic relationship with the defendant, a relationship that ended badly just weeks before she became a witness against him. The prosecution's star witness suddenly had a very clear motive to lie. Let's talk about motive and credibility for a moment. In the legal system, when evaluating witness testimony, juries are instructed to consider whether a witness has any bias, any reason to lie or shade the truth. A romantic relationship gone wrong is exactly the kind of thing that can create bias. It doesn't automatically mean the witness is lying, but it raises questions. It creates reasonable doubt. The prosecution knew this was a problem. Torres tried to rehabilitate Claire on redirect examination, asking her directly whether her personal feelings toward Jordan had influenced her testimony. Claire insisted they hadn't, that she was simply telling the truth about what she'd observed. But the sincerity in her voice couldn't erase the text messages, the emails, the timeline that showed her turning witness right after being rejected. The trial recessed for the day at 5:15. Judge Porter instructed the jury not to discuss the case, not to research anything online, to keep their minds open until all evidence had been presented. The jurors filed out, but their faces showed they were already processing what they'd heard. The prosecution's case, which had seemed so solid that morning, now looked shaky. That evening, Michael Torres and his team worked late in their office, strategizing. They couldn't unring the bell. The jury knew about the relationship now. The jury knew Claire's testimony had inconsistencies. The question was whether they could salvage the case without her. Could the documentary evidence stand alone? The bank records, the digital logs, the forensic accounting? Torres thought maybe it could. Maybe the jury would see Claire as one flawed piece in a larger puzzle. Priya Shah, meanwhile, was cautiously optimistic. She'd accomplished what she needed to on cross-examination. She'd shattered Claire's credibility. But she also knew the prosecution still had strong circumstantial evidence. The trial wasn't over. There would be closing arguments, jury instructions, deliberations. Anything could happen. Nobody knew that the next day would change everything. The trial resumed Thursday morning. The prosecution called its final witnesses, tying up loose ends, reinforcing the documentary evidence. Torres was trying to shift the jury's focus away from Claire, back to the hard facts. Numbers, dates, transactions that couldn't be explained away by faulty memory or romantic grudges. Then, unexpectedly, Priya Shah stood. "Your Honor, the defense recalls Claire Benton." The courtroom stirred with surprise. Recalling a witness after cross-examination was unusual but not unheard of. Judge Porter looked to Torres, who shrugged, caught off guard. "No objection, Your Honor." Claire returned to the witness stand, visibly more nervous than the day before. She avoided looking at anyone, her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap. Shah began gently. "Miss Benton, thank you for returning. I have just a few more questions. Yesterday, we discussed discrepancies between your testimony and phone location data. You stated you must have been confused about dates. Is that still your testimony?" "Yes," Claire said quietly. "And we discussed text messages showing a romantic relationship with Mr. Hale. You confirmed that relationship existed but ended in May 2022, correct?" "Correct. Miss Benton, I want to give you an opportunity. Right now, under oath in front of this jury and this court, is there anything about your previous testimony that you would like to correct or clarify?" The question hung in the air. It was a risky move by Shah. She was giving the witness a chance to repair some of the damage, to explain herself. But something in Shah's instinct told her this was the moment. She'd seen something in Claire's face the day before, something beyond nervousness, guilt maybe, conscience. Claire looked up, first at Shah, then at the jury, then at Jordan Hale sitting at the defense table. Jordan, who'd barely moved through the entire trial, was watching her with an expression that was hard to read, not angry, almost sad. And then Claire Benton started to cry. "I lied," she said, her voice breaking. "I lied about the dates. I lied about being in the office. I lied about overhearing conversations. Most of what I said wasn't true." The courtroom exploded. Judge Porter's gavel came down hard, calling for order, but the noise continued. Torres was on his feet, objecting, asking for a sidebar, his face flushed with anger and shock. Shah stood perfectly still, letting the moment unfold, knowing she'd just witnessed something rare in a courtroom, an unforced confession. When order was finally restored, Judge Porter addressed Claire directly. "Ms. Benton, I need you to be very clear. Are you saying you committed perjury?" Claire nodded, tears streaming now. "Yes, Your Honor." "You understand that perjury is a serious crime?" "I understand." "And you're making this statement voluntarily? No one has threatened you or promised you anything." "No one promised me anything. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep lying." Judge Porter looked at both attorneys. "Counsel, Chambers, now, jury, we're taking a recess. Do not discuss this case with anyone." The sidebar in Chambers lasted 40 minutes. Torres was furious, arguing that Claire was obviously being manipulated, that the defense had gotten to her somehow, that her recantation should be stricken from the record. Shah countered that Claire's statement was spontaneous and voluntary, that she'd simply asked if the witness wanted to correct her testimony, a standard question. Judge Porter, to her credit, remained calm. "Gentlemen, Ms. Shah, I'm going to allow this testimony. Ms. Benton has made a statement under oath. The jury heard it. We can't unhear it. The question now is what we do next. What happened next requires some legal context. When a witness recants testimony during a trial, it creates several problems. First, there's the perjury issue. Claire had just admitted on the record that she'd lied under oath. That's a felony. The judge could theoretically hold her in contempt right there, or refer the matter to prosecutors, but doing so during an ongoing trial would create chaos. Second, there's the impact on the current case. The prosecution's star witness had just destroyed her own credibility and admitted her testimony was false. That didn't automatically mean the defendant was innocent, but it certainly meant the prosecution's theory of the case had a giant hole in it. Third, there's the question of what to do with the jury. Some recantations lead to mistrials, trials that are declared invalid and have to start over from scratch. But mistrials are expensive, time-consuming, and not guaranteed to produce a different outcome. Judge Porter had to decide whether this case could continue or whether justice required starting over. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Porter made her ruling. The trial will continue. Ms. Benton's statement will remain on the record. The jury will be instructed to consider all of her testimony, including her admission today, when evaluating her credibility. Mr. Torres, you may redirect if you wish. Torres declined. What was there to ask? His witness had just admitted to lying. Anything he asked now would only make things worse. Shah also declined further questions. She'd gotten everything she needed. Claire was excused from the stand, but Judge Porter made clear she was not free to leave the jurisdiction. There would be consequences for perjury, but those would come later. For now, the trial had to proceed. Let's take a step back and understand what perjury really means and why it matters so much. Perjury isn't just about lying. People lie all the time in all sorts of contexts. We tell white lies to spare feelings, exaggerate stories to make them more interesting, misremember details, and fill in gaps with our imagination. But perjury is different because it's a lie told under oath in a legal proceeding about a material fact. That last part is important. Material fact. Not every lie under oath is perjury. If you testify that you're wearing a blue shirt when it's actually navy, that's not perjury because it's not material to the case. But if you testify that you saw someone commit a crime when you didn't, that's absolutely material. That's the kind of lie that can send an innocent person to prison. That's why the law treats it so seriously. In Claire's case, her lies were undeniably material. She'd testified about observing suspicious behavior, about overhearing conversations, about being present at specific times and places. All of that went to the heart of whether Jordan Hale was guilty. Her false testimony had been used to build a narrative of guilt, and now that narrative had collapsed. But here's where things get complicated. Claire had also told the truth eventually. She'd confessed on the stand voluntarily, without being directly accused. In the legal system, we value truth-telling, even when it comes late. We offer plea deals to accomplices who turn state's evidence. We give immunity to witnesses who cooperate. We reduce sentences for defendants who accept responsibility. The system is designed, at least in theory, to incentivize honesty. So what do we do with Claire? Do we prosecute her for the perjury she committed yesterday? Or do we credit her for the truth she told today? There's no easy answer. The prosecutor's office would have to make that call, and it would depend on multiple factors. How much damage did her false testimony do? Was she acting out of malice or confusion? Did she have her own attorney advising her? Was there evidence she'd been pressured by someone? For the moment, though, those questions would have to wait. The trial still had to reach a conclusion. Torres spent the rest of Thursday and all of Friday trying to salvage his case. He brought in additional expert witnesses to testify about the financial records, emphasizing that the documentary evidence didn't depend on Claire's testimony. He walked the jury through the transaction logs again, showing them the pattern of suspicious activity. He argued, in essence, that even if Claire Benton had lied about some things, the bank records didn't lie. It was a reasonable argument, but the jury had been shaken. You could see it in their faces, in their body language. The case they'd been hearing for 8 days had suddenly become something different. The star witness had confessed to perjury. How could they trust anything now? Priya Shah, in her case for the defense, was brief. She called a handful of witnesses to establish that multiple people had access to the accounts in question, that the firm's internal controls were lax, that the forensic analysis had gaps and assumptions. But mostly, she rested on what had already happened. Claire's confession had done her work for her. Then came closing arguments. Torres went first, as the prosecution always does. He stood before the jury and acknowledged the elephant in the room. "You heard Ms. Benton admit she lied. I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen. It did. And it's troubling. It's more than troubling. It's unacceptable. But I ask you to focus on what didn't change. The bank records didn't change. The digital logs didn't change. The $3 million that went missing didn't change. Jordan Hale had access, opportunity, and motive. The documentary evidence proves he committed these crimes, whether or not Claire Benton told the truth about seeing him do it. It was a solid closing, under the circumstances. Torres couldn't ignore what happened, so he tried to minimize it, to refocus the jury on the facts that remained uncontested. Priya Shah's closing was different. She didn't talk much about the financial evidence at all. Instead, she talked about doubt. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution just asked you to trust the evidence, even though their key witness admitted to lying. But how can you do that? How can you be sure about anything you've heard in this trial? Ms. Benton lied about being in the office. She lied about overhearing conversations. She lied about observing suspicious behavior. For 8 days, you listened to her testimony, and it sounded credible. The prosecutor believed her. The judge allowed her testimony, but it was all false. So I ask you, what else might be false? What other assumptions have we made that turned out to be wrong? She paused, letting the question settle. The standard in a criminal trial is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, not proof beyond some doubt, reasonable doubt. And after everything you've seen this week, can you honestly say you have no reasonable doubt about whether Jordan Hale committed these crimes? Can you be certain, absolutely certain, that he's guilty? Because if you can't, then you must acquit. That's not a technicality. That's the foundation of our justice system. It was effective. Shah had taken the prosecution's greatest strength, their mountain of evidence, and reframed it through the lens of Claire's confession. If they were wrong about Claire, what else were they wrong about? Torres got a rebuttal, as prosecutors always do. He tried to salvage the narrative one more time, reminding the jury that lies from one witness don't erase documentary evidence. But the energy in the courtroom had shifted. The jury looked tired, uncertain, ready for this to be over. Judge Porter spent Friday afternoon instructing the jury on the law. This is one of the most important parts of any trial, and it's often overlooked in dramatic retellings. Jury instructions are the roadmap that jurors use to navigate from evidence to verdict. They define the crimes charged, explain the elements the prosecution must prove, and outline the standards for evaluating witness credibility and evidence. Porter's instructions were careful and thorough. She explained each charge: fraud, conspiracy, obstruction. She defined reasonable doubt, emphasizing that it wasn't the same as all possible doubt, but it was more than mere speculation. And she gave a specific instruction about witness credibility. When evaluating the testimony of any witness, Porter read from her prepared instructions, you should consider whether the witness has any interest in the outcome of the case, any bias or prejudice, and whether the witness's testimony is consistent with other evidence or with the witness's own prior statements. If you find that a witness has lied about one matter, you may distrust their testimony about other matters, although you're not required to do so. That last sentence was critical. The jury could, if they chose, disregard everything Claire had said, or they could pick and choose, believing some parts and rejecting others. It was entirely up to them. Porter also gave a curative instruction specifically about Claire's confession. You have heard testimony from Ms. Benton in which she admitted that portions of her earlier testimony were not truthful. You may consider this admission when evaluating her credibility. However, the fact that one witness may have provided false testimony does not mean that other evidence in this case is unreliable. You must evaluate each piece of evidence independently. The judge was trying to balance things, to prevent the jury from throwing out the entire prosecution case just because one witness had lied. But there's only so much a jury instruction can do. Once doubt has entered the room, it's hard to remove. The jury began deliberating late Friday afternoon. By law, they couldn't be forced to reach a verdict quickly. Some juries deliberate for hours, some for days. In a complex case like this, with volumes of financial evidence and a star witness who'd recanted, everyone expected deliberations to take a while. They were wrong. The jury sent a note to Judge Porter at 9:45 Saturday morning. They'd reached a verdict. The speed surprised everyone. Veteran court watchers will tell you that fast verdicts usually favor the defense. When a jury convicts, they tend to take their time double-checking the evidence, making sure they're comfortable with the decision. When they acquit, the decision often comes quickly, because reasonable doubt is easy to find once you start looking for it. But you never really know until the verdict is read. The courtroom filled quickly Saturday morning. Word had spread that a verdict was imminent. Journalists who'd been covering the trial rushed back. Jordan Hale's family sat in the second row, holding hands, barely breathing. Torres and his team looked grim but composed, professionals accepting whatever was about to happen. Shah sat next to Jordan, her hand briefly touching his shoulder in a gesture of support or reassurance. Claire Benton was not in the courtroom. She'd been advised by an attorney she'd hastily retained that it would be better if she stayed away. Her confession had likely triggered a separate investigation into whether she'd be charged with perjury. For now, she was in legal limbo, waiting to learn her fate. Judge Porter entered, and the room stood. "Be seated," she said. "Madam Foreperson, I understand the jury has reached a verdict." The foreperson, a middle-aged woman who'd sat in the front row of the jury box throughout the trial, stood. "We have, Your Honor. Please hand the verdict form to the bailiff." The process felt agonizingly slow. The bailiff walked the form to the bench. Porter reviewed it silently, her face revealing nothing. Then she handed it back to the bailiff, who returned it to the foreperson. "The defendant will rise." Jordan Hale stood, Priya Shah beside him. His face was pale but steady. "Madam Foreperson, on the charge of fraud in the first degree, how do you find?" "We find the defendant not guilty." There was an audible gasp in the courtroom. Jordan's knees seemed to buckle for a moment, but he stayed upright. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, how do you find?" "Not guilty." "On the charge of obstruction of justice, how do you find?" "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Judge Porter gavelled for order, but didn't try too hard to contain the emotion. Jordan turned to Shah, and they embraced briefly. His family was crying in the gallery. Torres gathered his files with robotic precision, his face a mask of professional disappointment. Judge Porter thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. Then she turned to Jordan. "Mr. Hale, you are free to go. The charges against you are dismissed with prejudice, meaning they cannot be refiled. This case is concluded." And just like that, it was over. Not guilty. Two words that meant Jordan Hale's life wasn't over, that he wouldn't spend the next 15 years in prison, that he could walk out of that courtroom and try to rebuild what had been shattered over the past 18 months. But not guilty doesn't mean innocent. This is a distinction that matters, legally and morally. The jury hadn't concluded that Jordan definitely didn't commit the crimes. They'd concluded that the prosecution hadn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that he did. That gap between proven guilty and proven innocent is where the truth often lives in complicated cases. After the verdict, several jurors agreed to speak with reporters. Their comments were telling. One juror, a retired teacher, said, "Once we learned that the main witness had lied, we couldn't trust anything. The bank records were confusing, and without someone to explain what we were actually seeing, we just had too many questions." Another juror, a software engineer, was more nuanced. "I'm not saying Mr. Hale didn't do it. I'm saying I'm not convinced he did. There's a difference, but in our system, that difference matters. If there's reasonable doubt, we have to acquit." The foreperson, when asked about the speed of their deliberations, explained, "We took 2 informal polls. The first was split, 5 for acquittal, 4 for conviction, 3 undecided. But as we talked through the evidence, more people moved toward acquittal. By the time we took our formal vote, it was unanimous. Once Claire Benton admitted she'd lied, the foundation of the case fell apart." Michael Torres held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps. He was gracious in defeat, as prosecutors usually are, but you could see the frustration behind his words. "We respect the jury's verdict. That's how our system works. But I want to be clear. The investigation into the missing funds is not over. Just because Mr. Hale was acquitted doesn't mean the money wasn't stolen. It just means we couldn't prove he was the one who took it." Torres also addressed the Claire Benton situation. "We are reviewing all options regarding Ms. Benton's admitted perjury. That decision will be made in consultation with my office and the Attorney General. But I can tell you this. We take false testimony extremely seriously. It undermines the integrity of the entire judicial process." Priya Shah's statement was shorter. "Jordan Hale has maintained his innocence from day one. Today, a jury of his peers agreed that the prosecution failed to meet its burden of proof. We're grateful for the jury's careful attention and for a judge who ensured a fair trial. Now Jordan just wants to move forward with his life." Jordan himself didn't speak publicly that day. He left the courthouse through a side exit, surrounded by family, looking exhausted and relieved, and somehow diminished. Even in victory there was loss. His reputation had been shredded. His career in finance was likely over. People would always wonder, always whisper. That's the price of an acquittal in a high-profile case. But what about Claire? What happened to the woman whose confession had changed everything? That story took longer to unfold. The district attorney's office spent 3 weeks reviewing her case, interviewing her attorney, examining her motives and mental state. In the end, they made a deal. Claire would plead guilty to 1 count of perjury, a reduced charge in exchange for her cooperation and her spontaneous confession on the stand. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with eligibility for parole after 6 months. At her sentencing hearing, Claire addressed the court. "I know what I did was wrong. I was angry, I was hurt, and I convinced myself that I was telling the truth even when I wasn't. I told myself Jordan deserved what was happening because of how he'd treated me. But that's not how justice works. I lied under oath, and I almost sent an innocent man to prison. I'm ashamed of that, and I accept whatever punishment the court decides." The judge, not Renee Porter, but a different judge assigned to Claire's case, was direct in his comments. "Ms. Benton, your actions struck at the heart of our justice system. When witnesses lie, we cannot trust anything. However, I also note that you ultimately told the truth at great personal cost. That confession likely prevented a wrongful conviction. I'm going to balance those considerations in my sentence. 18 months was considered lenient by many observers. Perjury can carry up to 5 years in some jurisdictions. But the court recognized that Claire's ultimate honesty had mattered, that she'd corrected her lies before irreparable harm was done. There's a broader conversation here worth having, one that extends beyond this single case. Why do people commit perjury? Usually it's not for the reasons you'd think. Very few witnesses are cartoon villains who lie purely out of malice. More often, they're complicated people in complicated situations, under pressure, confused about their own memories, trying to protect themselves or someone they care about, or, like Claire, driven by emotions they can't fully control. The justice system tries to account for this. We have immunity deals to encourage cooperation. We have plea agreements to incentivize truth-telling. We have reduced sentences for defendants who accept responsibility. But we also have to maintain boundaries. Perjury has to carry consequences, or the whole system collapses. The question is always how to balance mercy with accountability. In Claire's case, the system found a middle ground. She would serve time, but not a decade. She would have a felony record, but she'd have a chance to rebuild her life. It wasn't perfect justice, but perfect justice rarely exists in the real world. Let's zoom out now and think about what this case really tells us. On the surface, it's a story about a trial that went sideways, about a confession that saved a defendant from wrongful conviction. But underneath, it's about something deeper, the cost of truth and the cost of lies. Jordan Hale was acquitted, but his life was forever changed. He couldn't get his old job back. The firm had terminated him during the investigation, and even with an acquittal, the taint remained. He'd applied to dozens of financial institutions, and none would hire him. Eventually, he found work as a consultant for a small startup, making a fraction of his former salary. Friends stopped calling. His romantic relationship fell apart under the strain. Acquittal gave him his freedom, but couldn't give him his life back. Claire Benton served her sentence and was released on parole after 8 months. She moved to a different city, changed her name legally, tried to start over, but a perjury conviction is hard to escape. Employers Google, background checks reveal. She ended up working retail, living in a small apartment, estranged from family who felt betrayed by what she'd done. The truth she'd eventually told had saved Jordan, but it had destroyed her own future. Michael Torres continued as district attorney. The loss didn't end his career, but it left a mark. He became more cautious about witness testimony, more aggressive about verifying every detail before trial. Some said he'd lost his edge. Others said he'd gained wisdom. Both might be true. Priya Shah's reputation grew. She became known as the attorney who could dismantle a prosecution's star witness, who could find the cracks in seemingly solid cases. Her practice flourished, but she was also more selective about which cases she took. She'd seen how close the system had come to failing Jordan, and it had shaken her faith in ways she didn't like to admit. Judge Renee Porter presided over hundreds more cases after the Hale trial. She never spoke publicly about that case specifically, but those who worked in her courtroom noticed small changes. She was more skeptical of witness testimony, more willing to grant defense motions for additional discovery, more careful about jury instructions. The case had reminded her how fragile the truth can be in a courtroom setting. And what about the truth itself? The $3 million never resurfaced. The investigation continued for another year before being closed without additional charges. To this day, no one knows for certain what happened to that money. Maybe Jordan took it and was lucky enough to get away with it. Maybe someone else at the firm was the real culprit, and they're still out there, living off stolen funds. Maybe the money was lost to some boring accounting error, and the whole criminal investigation was a waste of resources. We want closure. We want to know what really happened. But sometimes we don't get that satisfaction. Sometimes the best we can do is ensure that the process is fair, that the standards are met, that an innocent person isn't convicted because of lies and emotion and imperfect evidence. This case raises the moral question we posed at the beginning. Do we punish past lies when present truth can set the record straight? The justice system's answer was yes, but with mercy. Claire was punished, but not as severely as she could have been. She paid a price for her lies, but she also received credit for her honesty, however late it came. Is that the right answer? Reasonable people disagree. Some would say Claire should have received the maximum sentence, that perjury is unforgivable, regardless of eventual confession. Others would say she shouldn't have been prosecuted at all, that her confession was an act of courage that should be rewarded, not punished. The truth is, probably somewhere in the middle, which is where most moral questions live. Claire did wrong, and she faced consequences, but she also did right eventually, and that mattered too. Justice isn't about finding perfect solutions. It's about finding workable ones, solutions that acknowledge complexity while maintaining some standard of accountability. 3 years after the trial, a podcaster tracked down the key players for a retrospective episode. The podcast was called Reasonable Doubt, and it specialized in examining controversial verdicts and complicated cases. The episode about Jordan Hale and Claire Benton was titled The Confession That Changed Everything. Jordan agreed to an interview, his first public comments since the trial. He'd rebuilt parts of his life. He was engaged to someone he'd met at a support group for people who'd been wrongfully accused of crimes. He'd started a small consulting business that was doing reasonably well, but he was candid about the scars. "You don't just bounce back from something like that," he said. "Even though I was acquitted, there are still people who think I got away with something. I lost friends, lost career opportunities, lost years of my life to legal proceedings and stress. And the hardest part is knowing that it all could have been avoided if Claire had just told the truth from the beginning." When asked if he'd forgiven Claire, Jordan paused for a long time. "I'm working on it. I understand she was hurt. She was emotional. She made terrible decisions, but understanding doesn't erase what happened. She almost sent me to prison for crimes I didn't commit. That's not something you just forgive and forget." Claire also agreed to an interview, though she was more reluctant. She'd completed her parole and was trying to build a new life under her legal new name. The interview was conducted anonymously, her voice disguised. "I think about that trial every single day," she said. "I think about what I did, the lies I told, the damage I caused. I'm grateful I found the courage to tell the truth when I did, but I also know I should have never lied in the first place. I was motivated by hurt feelings and anger, and I told myself I was serving justice when really I was serving revenge. That's something I have to live with forever." And gay. When asked what made her finally confess, Claire's answer was simple. "I looked at Jordan sitting there, and I realized I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't send someone to prison based on my lies. Even if he had hurt me personally, that wasn't justice. That was just cruelty dressed up as testimony." Michael Torres declined to participate in the podcast, but his office released a brief statement. The Hale case was a reminder that criminal prosecution depends on reliable evidence and credible witnesses. We learned valuable lessons about witness vetting and corroboration. Every case makes us better prosecutors, even the ones we lose. Priya Shah gave the podcaster a lengthy interview, reflecting on the case's broader implications. "What happened in that courtroom is every defense attorney's nightmare and every prosecutor's nightmare for different reasons. The system came very close to convicting someone based primarily on false testimony. If Claire hadn't confessed, if the phone data hadn't been available, if the jury had been just a little more willing to overlook the inconsistencies, Jordan Hale would be in prison right now. That should terrify everyone." Shah also spoke about the responsibility that comes with witness testimony. "We put so much weight on eyewitness accounts, on people getting on the stand and saying, 'I saw this,' or 'I heard that.' But memory is fallible, and people have biases, and sometimes they have agendas. The criminal justice system needs to do better at verifying witness testimony before we put someone's life in the hands of 12 strangers based on words alone." The podcast episode ended with a broader question posed by the host. In the end, did justice prevail in the Jordan Hale case? The answer, like most answers in the legal system, was complicated. Jordan was acquitted, which seems like justice if he was innocent. But he still suffered enormous harm, lost years of his life, and never fully recovered his reputation. Claire told the truth eventually, but only after lying for months and nearly destroying an innocent man. She was punished, but was the punishment proportional to the harm? And what about the missing $3 million, which was never recovered and never fully explained? Justice, in this case, was imperfect. But perhaps that's the most honest way to describe it. The system worked, in the sense that it prevented a wrongful conviction. The system failed, in the sense that it allowed false testimony to proceed for so long before being exposed. The truth emerged, but not quickly, not cleanly, not without casualties. This case offers several important lessons about how our justice system works and where it can fail. Let's walk through them, because these aren't just abstract legal principles. These are real issues that affect real cases every day in courtrooms across the country. First, witness credibility matters more than almost anything else in a criminal trial. Juries are instructed to evaluate evidence objectively, but human beings are storytelling creatures. We're wired to respond to narratives, to personal testimony, to someone looking us in the eye and telling us what happened. Documentary evidence, no matter how strong, often takes a backseat to a compelling witness. That's why prosecutors invest so much time preparing their witnesses, and why defense attorneys invest so much energy trying to undermine them. The problem is that credibility is subjective. What makes a witness seem believable? Confidence, detail, consistency. Sometimes those very qualities are what make a liar most dangerous. Claire Benton was confident. Her story had details. She'd been consistent across multiple statements, and she was lying. Second, relationships matter. Claire's romantic history with Jordan was directly relevant to her motivation and bias, yet it took defense investigation to uncover it. The prosecution either didn't know about the relationship or didn't think it was important enough to disclose. Either possibility is troubling. In criminal cases, the prosecution has an obligation to turn over exculpatory evidence, evidence that might help the defense. Brady v. Maryland, a landmark Supreme Court case, established this principle. But Brady violations happen regularly, sometimes through malice, but more often through oversight or differing opinions about what's truly exculpatory. If Priya Shah hadn't done her homework, if she hadn't subpoenaed text messages and emails, the jury might never have learned about Jordan and Claire's relationship, and without that knowledge, they might have believed every word Claire said. Third, technology is changing the game. Phone location data has become a crucial tool in both prosecuting and defending criminal cases. Your phone tracks your movements constantly, creating a digital record of where you've been. This can exonerate innocent people and convict guilty ones, but it also raises privacy concerns that our legal system is still grappling with. Should the government be able to access your location data without a warrant? Should defense attorneys? What if the data is wrong or incomplete? These are questions without easy answers. Fourth, the confession on the stand was extraordinary, but not unprecedented. Witnesses do sometimes recant testimony, though usually not in the dramatic way Claire did. More often, recantations come later, after the trial is over, after someone has been convicted, when it's much harder to undo the damage. The Innocence Project and similar organizations have documented hundreds of cases where witnesses later admitted they lied or were mistaken, but by then, the defendant had already served years in prison. Claire's confession came at the right moment, during the trial, when the jury could still hear it and adjust their verdict accordingly. That timing saved Jordan, but it also raises questions about why she waited so long. She'd lied in her initial statements to investigators, lied in her pre-trial deposition, lied during direct examination. Only when confronted with contradictory evidence during cross-examination, only when given one more chance to come clean, did she finally tell the truth. How many witnesses have similar moments of conscience, but never act on them? Fifth, the consequences of perjury are real but rarely enforced. Thousands of people testify in court every day. A percentage of them are lying. Some lie about small details, others about major facts. But very few are ever prosecuted for perjury. Why? Because proving perjury is difficult. You have to show that the person knowingly lied about a material fact, not that they were mistaken or confused. You have to show intent, which requires getting inside someone's head. And prosecutors have limited resources, so they tend to focus on perjury cases that are clear-cut and egregious. Claire's case was clear-cut because she admitted it. But if she hadn't confessed, if she'd simply maintained her testimony despite the phone data contradictions, would she have been prosecuted? Probably not. She could have argued she was confused about dates, that her memory was faulty but not intentionally false. And without a confession, proving otherwise would have been nearly impossible. This creates a perverse incentive. If you lie under oath and get caught in the lie, your best strategy might be to dig in, to claim confusion rather than admit perjury, because the moment you admit it, as Claire did, you've handed prosecutors everything they need to convict you. Claire did the morally right thing, but it came at great personal cost. That's not how the system should work. but that's how it does work. Sixth, the standard of reasonable doubt is simultaneously the justice system's greatest strength and its most frustrating weakness. It's a strength because it protects innocent people from being convicted on flimsy evidence, on hunches and suspicions and maybes. The prosecution has to prove its case. The defendant doesn't have to prove innocence. That's a fundamental protection, a bulwark against tyranny. But it's also a weakness because it means some guilty people will go free. If the prosecution's case has holes, if witnesses are unreliable, if evidence is ambiguous, the jury is supposed to acquit even if they suspect the defendant probably did it. That's frustrating for victims, for prosecutors, for society at large. We want certainty. We want closure. We want to know that the guilty are punished and the innocent are protected. But certainty is rare in criminal trials. Most cases exist in a grey zone where the evidence points toward guilt but doesn't prove it beyond all doubt, or where the defendant probably didn't do it, but there's no way to be absolutely sure. Reasonable doubt tries to navigate that grey zone, but reasonable people can disagree about what constitutes reasonable doubt. That's why we have juries, 12 perspectives instead of one, trying to reach consensus about an inherently uncertain question. In Jordan's case, the jury decided that Claire's confession created too much uncertainty. Without her testimony, the prosecution's case rested on circumstantial evidence that could be interpreted in different ways. That was enough for reasonable doubt. But another jury, with different people, different life experiences, different tolerances for ambiguity, might have convicted anyway. There's no objective answer to whether they made the right call. Seventh, and finally, the case reminds us that justice is a process, not an outcome. We talk about serving justice or justice being done, as if justice is a destination we can reach. But really, justice is the system we've built to navigate impossible situations where we can't know the full truth, where human beings make mistakes and tell lies and act from mixed motives. The process is what matters. Did both sides get a fair chance to present their case? Was the defendant represented by competent counsel? Was the jury given proper instructions? Was evidence evaluated according to established rules? Did the judge maintain impartiality? By those measures, Jordan Hale received justice. The process worked, even if the outcome left everyone somewhat unsatisfied. He got a fair trial, a vigorous defense, a jury that took its responsibility seriously, and a judge who ensured the rules were followed. The system bent under pressure but didn't break. That might not feel like enough. Jordan's life was still damaged. Claire still lied for months before telling the truth. The missing money was never recovered. But the alternative, a system that rushes to judgment or accepts lies as truth or convicts people based on anger rather than evidence, would be far worse. Let's return to the question we posed at the beginning. Do we punish past lies when present truth can set the record straight? The legal system answered yes, but with nuance. Claire was convicted and sentenced, but her confession was treated as a mitigating factor. She faced consequences, but not the maximum consequences. The system tried to balance accountability with mercy, punishment with recognition of her ultimate honesty. But is that the right moral answer? There are arguments on both sides. On one hand, Claire's lies were serious and harmful. She put an innocent man through hell. She wasted court resources, undermined public confidence in the justice system, and abused the trust that society places in sworn witnesses. The fact that she eventually told the truth doesn't erase those harms. If we don't punish perjury, we send a message that lying under oath is acceptable as long as you eventually come clean. That's a dangerous message. On the other hand, Claire's confession prevented a wrongful conviction. If she'd maintained her lies, Jordan would likely have been convicted and sent to prison. By telling the truth when it mattered most, she saved an innocent man. Shouldn't that count for something? If we punish people harshly for confessing, we disincentivize honesty. We encourage witnesses to double down on their lies rather than admit them. That's also dangerous. The moral weight of her actions depends on what you think the justice system is for. Is it primarily punitive, designed to make people pay for their wrongs? Or is it primarily corrective, designed to get to the truth and produce just outcomes? Both purposes are valid, and both pull in different directions when it comes to cases like Claire's. There's also a personal dimension. Claire wasn't an evil person. She was a hurt person who made terrible decisions out of anger and pain. She convinced herself that Jordan deserved what was happening to him because he'd rejected her, ended their relationship callously, made her feel used. In her mind, she was balancing some cosmic scale, getting justice for emotional harm by supporting criminal charges for financial harm. But that's not how justice works. You don't get to decide someone deserves prison because they broke your heart. You don't get to weaponize the criminal justice system to settle personal grievances. Claire learned that lesson, painfully and publicly. The question is whether the punishment she received was proportional to both her crime and her eventual redemption. Reasonable people will disagree. Some readers will think Claire got off too easy, that 18 months for trying to send an innocent man to prison for 15 years is a joke. Others will think she shouldn't have been prosecuted at all, that her confession was an act of courage that should be celebrated rather than punished. The judge who sentenced Claire split the difference, which is what judges often do. Solomon's wisdom, cutting the baby in half, trying to satisfy competing interests, even though nobody walks away completely happy. 3 years after the podcast episode, 5 years after the trial, the case continued to have ripples. Law schools used it as a teaching tool, asking students to grapple with the ethical questions it raised. Should prosecutors have caught Claire's lies earlier? Did the defense have an obligation to offer Claire immunity in exchange for honest testimony, or was ambushing her with contradictory evidence a legitimate tactic? Criminal justice reform advocates pointed to the case as an example of why witness testimony needs to be corroborated with physical evidence. If the prosecution had verified Claire's story with phone data before the trial, they would have discovered the lies and either secured truthful testimony or found a different witness. Instead, they took her word at face value, trusted that she was telling the truth, and built their case on a foundation of sand. Defense attorneys used the case to argue for broader discovery rights, for access to more information about prosecution witnesses before trial. If the rules had required the prosecution to turn over information about Claire's relationship with Jordan earlier, the defense could have investigated sooner, could have confronted Claire before the trial ever started. Maybe she would have confessed then, privately, and the whole spectacle could have been avoided. But prosecutors pushed back, arguing that broader discovery rights would make their jobs impossible, would allow defendants to intimidate witnesses, would turn every trial into a fishing expedition where the defense demanded access to every email, every text message, every personal detail about every witness. The debate continues, as it should. There are no perfect answers in criminal justice reform, only trade-offs between competing values. We want to protect the innocent, but we also want to convict the guilty. We want vigorous defense, but we also want efficient prosecution. We want privacy, but we also want transparency. We want mercy, but we also want accountability. The Jordan Hale case doesn't resolve these tensions. It just illuminates them, showing us how complicated justice really is when you move beyond abstract principles and look at real people in real situations making real decisions under pressure. Jordan Hale, now 39, has largely moved on with his life. He married his fiancée 2 years after the trial. They have a young daughter. He still works in consulting, though he'll never make the kind of money he once did in high finance. He's written a book about his experience titled Presumed Guilty: How I Survived a Trial Built on Lies. It's sold modestly, mostly to people interested in criminal justice issues. He occasionally speaks at legal conferences about wrongful accusations and the importance of witness verification. In interviews, Jordan says he's found peace, though it took years of therapy and a lot of support from family. He doesn't think about the trial every day anymore, though certain triggers bring it back. Courtroom dramas on television, news stories about perjury, the anniversary of his arrest. But mostly, he focuses on the present, on his family, on building a life defined by more than those terrible 18 months. Claire Benton completed her parole and disappeared from public view. She deleted all social media, changed her name legally, moved to a different state. The few people who've kept track of her say she works in a bookstore, lives quietly, hasn't committed any crimes since her release. She declined all interview requests after the podcast, and there's no indication she plans to ever speak publicly about the case again. Some people think she's a coward for hiding. Others think she's smart for moving on. The truth, as always, is probably more complicated. Claire committed a serious wrong, paid a price, and is trying to live with the consequences. What more can society ask of her? But also, what more does she owe the man she almost destroyed? Michael Torres served 2 more terms as district attorney before deciding not to run again. He's now a professor at a law school, teaching trial advocacy and ethics. He's candid with his students about the Hale case, using it as an example of how even experienced prosecutors can be fooled by a witness who seems credible but isn't. He tells them to verify everything, to trust but verify, to remember that their obligation is to justice, not to winning. In private conversations, Torres admits the case changed him. He'd been so certain of Jordan's guilt, so confident that the evidence was solid. The confession blindsided him, made him question his own judgment. For a while, he second-guessed himself on every case, wondering if he was missing something, if a witness was lying, if he was about to make another terrible mistake. Eventually, he found his footing again, but the doubt never completely disappeared. Maybe that's not a bad thing. A little doubt keeps you humble, keeps you careful. Priya Shah continues to practice criminal defense in Atlanta. The Hale case raised her profile significantly, and she now takes on high-stakes cases exclusively. She's more expensive than she used to be, which means she represents fewer indigent clients, a fact that bothers her sometimes. She still does pro bono work, still believes in the fundamental importance of defense attorneys, still fights hard for her clients, but she's also more cynical than she was before the Hale trial. She's seen how close the system came to failing, how one woman's lies almost sent an innocent man to prison, how easily it could have ended differently. She doesn't trust prosecutors the way she once did, doesn't trust witnesses, doesn't trust the system to self-correct. She trusts herself, her investigative team, her ability to find the truth in a stack of documents and a timeline of phone pings. Judge Renee Porter retired from the bench last year after 20 years of service. She presided over hundreds of trials, handed down thousands of rulings, saw the best and worst of human nature paraded through her courtroom. But when people ask her about memorable cases, she always mentions Jordan Hale and Claire Benton. "It was the most dramatic moment I've ever witnessed in a courtroom," she said in her retirement interview, "and the most troubling, because it made me wonder how many other cases have had witnesses who lied but never confessed, never got caught, never had a crisis of conscience. How many innocent people are in prison right now because a witness lied and nobody ever found out? It's a haunting question, and I don't have an answer." She's right. It is haunting, and we don't have an answer. Which brings us to the core mystery that never got resolved. What actually happened to the $3 million? The investigation closed without charges beyond Jordan's case. The firm recovered some of the money through insurance claims, but most of it was gone, dissolved into the complex web of shell accounts and international transfers. Forensic accountants traced it as far as they could, but the trail went cold in offshore banks with strict privacy laws. Did Jordan take the money? The jury said the prosecution didn't prove it, but that's not the same as proving he didn't. He had access. He had knowledge of how to move money without triggering immediate alarms. And despite being acquitted, he still can't fully account for some of his activities during the period in question. Jordan maintains his innocence. He's passed a polygraph, though those aren't admissible in court and aren't foolproof. He's submitted to interviews, answered questions, provided access to his financial records. If he took the money, he's hidden it very well, or spent it in ways that left no trace, or stashed it somewhere waiting for attention to die down. Or maybe he didn't take it at all. Maybe Claire was lying about some things, but telling the truth about others. Maybe she knew more than she let on, had her own role in the scheme, and turned on Jordan to protect herself. Her immunity deal meant she couldn't be prosecuted for anything she disclosed during her cooperation. What if she disclosed everything except her own involvement? Or maybe someone else at the firm was the real culprit, someone who's never been identified, who watched the investigation focus on Jordan and breathed a sigh of relief when he was acquitted. After all, if Jordan didn't take the money and Claire was lying about most of what she said, then the money still went somewhere. Someone still stole it. The truth is, we don't know. We'll probably never know. The case is closed, the investigation ended, the principals have moved on with their lives. The $3 million has become a ghost story, a mystery without a solution, a reminder that sometimes the justice system can prevent wrongful convictions without actually solving the underlying crime. That ambiguity is frustrating, but it's also honest. Real life doesn't always provide closure. Real cases don't always wrap up neatly, with every question answered and every loose end tied. Sometimes we have to live with uncertainty, with questions that don't have answers, with outcomes that leave everyone slightly dissatisfied. The Hale case gave us a moment of dramatic truth when Claire confessed on the stand. But it didn't give us the whole truth, the complete story, the satisfaction of knowing exactly what happened and why. Maybe that's the real lesson. Justice is about process and fairness, not about omniscience. We do our best with imperfect information, imperfect witnesses, imperfect memory, and imperfect evidence. And sometimes our best is good enough to prevent disaster, even if it doesn't provide perfect understanding. Under oath, the confession that stunned the court is more than just a courtroom drama. It's a mirror held up to our justice system, showing us both its resilience and its fragility. The system worked in the sense that an innocent man wasn't convicted, but it nearly failed, and only Claire's last-minute confession prevented disaster. What does this case teach us about truth? That it's slippery, subjective, often hidden beneath layers of emotion and self-interest. That people lie for complicated reasons, not just because they're bad, but because they're hurt or scared or confused. That truth can emerge in unexpected moments when conscience finally overcomes self-preservation. What does it teach us about justice? That it's a process, not a destination. That it requires constant vigilance, careful investigation, skepticism about seemingly credible witnesses, and willingness to admit when we're wrong. That it's expensive, time-consuming, emotionally exhausting, and still the best system we've developed for adjudicating guilt and innocence. What does it teach us about mercy? That it has a place even in a justice system that demands accountability. That Claire's confession, however late, mattered. That we can punish past wrongs while acknowledging present courage. That moral questions rarely have simple answers. The case began with 3 words spoken in a silent courtroom. I lied before. Those 3 words changed everything, unraveled a prosecution, saved a defendant, and destroyed a witness. They echo forward through time, a reminder that words matter, that truth matters, that what we say under oath can have consequences far beyond anything we imagine. In the end, the Hale case doesn't offer easy lessons or simple morals. It offers complexity, ambiguity, questions without definitive answers. It shows us justice as it really is, messy, imperfect, sometimes magnificent and sometimes barely functional, always dependent on human beings trying their best to navigate impossible situations. 3 words under oath changed one man's life, one woman's future, and one trial's outcome. They remind us why we have courts, why we demand truth-telling, why we treat perjury as a serious crime. The system isn't perfect, but on that day, in that courtroom, When Claire Benton finally found the courage to tell the truth, the system worked. That has to be enough. Because in the real world, in real courtrooms, with real people facing real consequences, perfection is impossible. All we can do is try to get it right, to correct mistakes when we find them, to value truth even when it comes late and costs everything. Jordan Hale walked free because Claire Benton confessed. That confession cost her 18 months in prison, her reputation, her future. But it also saved an innocent man from 15 years behind bars. In the moral calculus of the justice system, that trade-off is messy and unsatisfying and probably the best we could hope for. The gavel falls, the jury is dismissed, the defendant goes home, the witness goes to prison, the prosecutors regroup, the judge moves on to the next case. And somewhere, $3 million remains missing, a mystery unsolved, a question unanswered. A reminder that truth is always partial and justice is always incomplete. This is, under oath, the confession that stunned the court.